Prison potatoes.
Boil them, mash them. Hello everybody, it's time for NetDeck. This one was conceived by Laurie, also known as Larry Poultry, who won a store championship with it. So I thought that it's definitely worth a shot. And basically what really interests me about this deck is that practically every single card in this deck has something to do with net damage. That's crazy. Your objective here is to simply overwhelm the runner with so much net damage that they will eventually get milled one way or another. We'll see if we can do that. And we have a pretty good guinea pig for our testing today. We have Andromeda, who doesn't tend to run Levy or any sort of net damage protection, you would hope. So they really do have a finite amount of hit points, and we'll try to exploit that as much as possible. I began with an opening of Celebrity Gift. It was very lucky that I drew into DNA Tracker. This allowed me to actually install the HQ DNA Tracker without worrying about an early Siphon, because if the only ice I could show was Data Mine, I would get early Siphon pretty easily. So that would be a problem. My opponent daringly runs R&D last click here, which is definitely a play mistake. One should always run R&D not on the last click, especially when you have an Earthrise and Daily Cast sticking down. My opponent should have ran it third click before, say, installing the Daily Cast or the Earthrise last click, so that they can clear tags if need be. Luckily for my opponent, they didn't hit a snare, so the game goes on. Instead, they do hit a Global Foot, bringing them up to 2 points and in the lead. I take advantage of this early time when my opponent isn't really set up to make a very threatening server, a Data Mine into Hokusai Grid. Given the early Celebrity Gift, my opponent should be able to deduce the contents of the server, and probably suspects that the item in the server is a Jackson Howard. What they don't know is that it is a nasty House of Knives that is going to do a lot of damage to them. Each House of Knives is worth 6 points, 3 from net damage and 3 from Potatoes Unleashed milling. So this is going to be a really good score for me if I can get it off. Thankfully, it seems like my opponent does not have inside job. Instead, they're just setting up their resource rig, so I'm more than happy to score the House of Knives here. I draw into Friends in High Places. Now this is a new card that came out in Martial Law, and believe me, this card is pretty efficient for what it does. The fact that you can install 2 cards with a single operation is actually quite huge. There's not much else that allows you to do that. Mirror Morph is one, but what Friends in High Places really lets you do is that it performs recursion for you, and that's really key in a lot of acid spam decks, and this is no different. This is not technically an acid spam deck, but you are relying on the Hostile Infrastructure into Bioethics Association combo, and having this sort of recursion really helps enable you get a critical mass of net damage on the board, so much so that your opponent can't really deal with it in a timely fashion. So what my opponent's attempting to do right now is, instead of running and potentially triggering House of Knives, my opponent is setting up their rig. They are making sure that they get their Decoder out, their Fractor out, and their Killer before begin running, because if I so happen to luckily mill my opponent's breakers or snipe them from hand, they'll be in a lot of trouble if they cannot get through my ice. So this is a very good strategy for my opponent. It also denies me the chance to use House of Knives right now, which I would really love to. This is when House of Knives would be most impactful. I'm going to start icing up my servers here, and then jam the Jackson into the remote. This is part bait, but also part protection. If I can keep the Jackson Howard secure in this remote for the entire game, I can do a lot of shenanigans. As you likely are aware of, Jackson Howard is a very powerful card that allows you to control agenda flow and speeds up your draw. More importantly, if you're able to protect it, the runner will not be able to contest that server, so the only way they can force the Jackson out is to run your bin. And most runners don't want to, because typically against Potatoes Unleashed, there's a lot of rotten potatoes in the bin, also known as shocks. No one wants to get hit with rotten potatoes. Of course, there are no rotten potatoes in the bin right now. I'm sure you notice I haven't drawn them yet, but that's the beauty of putting Jackson in the remote. I can then accelerate my draw and hopefully start finding the shocks that I need to make every single server spiky. Now my opponent places Temujin on HQ here, which is an extremely questionable decision. I suppose they want to hammer HQ because they know that I haven't really been scoring agendas, and that the ice on HQ is more or less known. He probably knows that it's a DNA tracker. But then he makes a very, very weird play. After playing Temujin, he plays the Employee Strike, which is fine, and then goes in for the Account Siphon. Knowing full well that's a DNA tracker, he needs 7 credits to break it with Guardian Blade, but he only has 5. So yeah, I really, really don't understand what my opponent's doing here. I think that was just a lapse in concentration or something. So they get swiftly punished for it. The Account Siphon will be able to land, but not only that, they know that it's a DNA tracker. I can dump all my money into rezzing DNA tracker and making the Siphon useless. So yes, they can break 1 subroutine. I'll fire 2 subroutines for 2 net damage. And then I'm able to use House of Knives for 1 more damage, making it a grand total of 3 net damage. Usually here, I would not use the House of Knives token. The reason is you want to save the House of Knives token for maximum effect. That is when you can snipe 1 card from hand and mill 1 card from their stack. I can't mill 1 because Employee Strike is active, so I should be conserving my Knives token. That being said, I suspected that my opponent wanted to swing over to my remote last click and check it without any threat of net damage. So this is why I fired the House of Knives token here. But in retrospect, that was wrong, because I knew that I could res the remote ice regardless. The data mine costs 0 to res. I forgot about that. So if my opponent decided to check my remote with 1 card remaining, they could get hit by the data mine for 1 net damage, and then a House of Knives token for another net damage to flatline them. Too long didn't listen. I shouldn't have used the Knives token. I should have saved it for the remote run if my opponent was intending to swing over to my remote. No matter, that's fine. My opponent doesn't check the remote anyway. Good on them. They know that by going down to 0 cards, it was very unsafe to check the remote, so they chose not to, which is good. And they left themselves on 1 card at the end of their turn, which means I can't kill them. I don't have the money to, and I don't have the Neuro EMPs in my hand, so that's that for now. Unfortunate, because this was a very good kill window. Right now, my opponent will almost certainly draw up for their turn, and putting them out of kill range. At least this gives me 1 turn of security. 1 turn to start setting up, and that's quite important because this is a very dangerous turn for me. The last thing I want to do is to get Siphon this turn. If I get Siphon, I lose 4 credits, setting me back pretty far. I could rest the Hokusai to deny a bit, but what I really want to do is to get into Hedge Fund range. My next turn, as you can see from my hand, is almost certainly going to be Credit, Hedge Fund, play Hostile Infrastructure. Once I get a Hostile on the board, I can start ducking Siphons, which is really cool. So in the meantime, I'm just waiting for my opponent to slowly draw up. They don't really have much of a say or choice in this matter. If they have an Account Siphon, this would actually be a really good time to play it. As much as they can't really duck it, playing it right now is better than playing it when I have Hostile Infrastructure up. I really wish I had Shock in the bin right there and then to deny the Dirty Laundry, make it very spiky, but unfortunately the draws haven't been good. Again, another questionable decision, running last click into my server. I'm not sure what my opponent's expecting here, but what I'm sure is that I'm going to fire data mine and then allow my opponent to continue for a successful run. If they continue, they lose the game immediately. They know that there's a Hokusai grid somewhere on the board, and given that there are no other upgrades on in the game, it's probably on the remote. If they made a successful run here, I would rest the Hokusai grid for 1 net, House of Knives for another net, and I would win. My opponent jacks out smartly, and then I mandatory draw into the Neuro EMP, which was a big facepalm moment. If I had sniped my opponent with the House of Knives damage on encounter with the data mine, I would have won the game. Of course, I didn't see the Neuro EMP coming, so you can't really blame me for conserving my knife token. But that was such a pity. That was a very good opportunity to kill a very careless runner, but I missed it. No matter, I'm still going to go through with my plan that I mentioned earlier. Credit Hedge Fund, Hostile Infrastructure, and maintains a pretty good game state. My opponent is halfway through the deck, so I only have a couple more cards to chew through. And this is when I start powering up my game with Jackson Howard. I finally get the momentum I need to begin drawing up and threatening my opponent. After 2 double draws, I decide to install House of Knives because my opponent doesn't seem interested in checking my remotes. Then of course, I fortify Archives with Shock and head on my merry way. This would be a double whammy if I actually manage to score a House of Knives. I would get an overwhelming amount of net damage with House of Knives, but more importantly, turn off Employee Strike, so that my House of Knives will become doubly dangerous. Of course, this is assuming my opponent doesn't check my remote. What they do instead is to install John Masnori and make the easy run on my remote. Dang! What a waste. Well, yeah, what could I have done about that? I really wanted to keep the Jackson Howard in server 1, so there was no version of me removing Jackson from the game. Being able to hyper draw through my deck and ditch agendas into bin is so good, especially when your opponent doesn't want to run the bin. Unfortunately, this comes at the cost of my agenda. My opponent called my bluff, and maybe I should just install the snare from my hand instead. That would teach them something about face checking my remotes. So I draw a celebrity gift here, and I think it really makes sense to just show my entire hand since there are no agendas. And maybe play a Neuro EMP. Again, I want to conserve the Neuro EMP for times when Employee Strike is inactive. So I'm just going to keep them in hand for now. Instead, fortifying R&D, knowing that medium's on the board, I need to respect the deep dick threat. So having a double ice on R&D should deter my opponent from going too aggressive on R&D. That's how I'm going to lose. My opponent running R&D 4 times in a turn. I need to prevent that. Another objective I need to accomplish is, because medium is active, I need to start thinking about recycling snares into my R&D to make it all the more spikier. But the plan changes the moment I find Bioethics Association. With Bioethics, I can now begin my combo, which is get Hostiles and Bioethics active. If they trash it, recur them with friends in high places and do it all over again. This should be pretty fun. For certain definitions of fun, of course. My opponent needs to win quickly before they get swamped by the hostile infrastructures and bioethics. One good thing about this deck is that it actually runs a lot of money, unlike typical IG49, which typically only runs Breaker Bay Grids and hedge funds. This deck has celebrity gifts, it has pop-up windows, in addition to the hedge funds. So I can afford to fuel the high res cost of hostile infrastructure. My opponent's still busy trying to set up, and they've finally done so. They found a paperclip. I don't really agree with my opponent's line of play here, which is to play so defensively and passively until they found a paperclip. There was no need to get paperclip in this match at all. They could simply run, and if they hit a barrier, they would just bounce off, end the run. They can always get a paperclip later. The fact that they had to use a special order to summon the paperclip, that's one less hit point my opponent has, and every hit point counts against Potatoes Unleashed, so I definitely don't agree with wasting the special order there. I feel like he could have just manually drawn into the paperclip. So my opponent hits a shock, and the shock snipes the paperclip from hand. And then, my opponent decides to hit Archives on their last click with 4 cards in hand. This usually looks like a safe play, but after doing some basic arithmetic, 1 shock in Archives, 1 Bioethics on the board, 2 Neuro EMPs in hand, and a House of Knives token. That's 5 if my count is right. That means my opponent will flatline as long as I use the House of Knives token, which I did, and swiftly dispose of my opponent. Into the bin she goes with all the rotten potatoes. So what do I think about this Prison Potatoes deck? Well, I got an easy matchup. This deck seems very favoured as long as your opponent is non-Anarch and does not have feedback filter. Even Levy AR Lab Access isn't guaranteed to win, since I run Arc Lockdown and could see it early. Anarch is the real problem matchup that I think needs more testing to verify, because I think it is not a good matchup at all. There are lots of different good Anarch cards that just cause a lot of problems for Potatoes Unleashed nowadays, like Slums, Wizard, Edward Kim, Siphon, and Obelus. It basically makes the runner impregnable, and AI Breakers kind of turn off one of your important sources of net damage, which is Data Mine. Compare that to Criminals and Shapers, which typically have no answer to Data Mine and have to suck up the 1 or 2 hit point loss with Potatoes combined from Data Mine. I think Data Mine is a very ingenious include by Laurie, and I think was a very crucial element to his success. That being said, if you don't meet too many Anarchs during a tournament, you're going to be in a good place. Friends in High Places is an incredibly inefficient card for what it does. It basically allows you to recall whatever that you have trashed or your opponent has trashed. That's more net damage piling on and is so much better than preemptive action. With preemptive action, you shuffle them in your deck and you have to wait until you draw them again, which could be a long time. Whereas with Friends in High Places, you get them back immediately, and if it's a Bioethics, you're threatening them immediately with more net damage on the next turn. The one thing this deck lacks, as evidenced by this game, is a countercurrent versus Employee Strike. I felt like had my opponent played more carefully this game, they could have grinded out a win against me, because all they needed were 2 more agendas, and they still had a lot of hit points left to go. So I think I need some way to get rid of Employee Strike besides scoring out House of Knives, and Cerebrostatic, being the infection current for Jintaki, is the obvious choice, as it negates Wizard as well, one of your hard counters, since Wizard can easily trash your hostile infrastructures and hook side grids. One important point about this Prison Potatoes deck that is lacking in my former Potato deck, some people have pointed out, is that my former Potato deck was not able to threaten a win. If the opponent knows my deck list, they can choose not to run at all, and there's no way I can win, because my deck is used to be very reliant on snares, shocks, and Neuro EMPs to kill the runner. But this deck has an active kill condition in the form of Bioethics Association, which is why it's a lot better in tournament setting. Because if your opponent plays too passively, they will eventually grind out. They have to run. They have to run the Bioethics, and this opens them up to more net damage from House of Knives, hostile infrastructures, and Neuro EMPs. You saw how incredibly efficient I was at killing my opponent. They started their 4th click with 4 cards in hand, and they still flatlined at the end of my turn. That's the amount of damage you can pile up. That's the amount of potatoes you can generate with Potatoes Unleashed. Never underestimate the power of the Spud. Thanks for watching, happy night running. Hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.